for your kind and generous introduction. And thank you, Katrina, for laying the context and the foundation for this discourse, which I'm happy to participate. And I wish to congratulate and celebrate UWI STAT and all of you here for recognizing the importance of this conversation for all of us, for the Caribbean people, and for the world at large. Because in 2001, 20 years ago, when the United Nations held the first global conference to address the issue of post-colonial racism and intolerance in the world, and prejudice and xenophobia, in my plenary address, I made the statement that the reparations movement is going to be the greatest political movement of the century. The century had just started, 2001. So many people, I think, thought that my statement was extreme, hyperbolic, and an exaggeration. But I felt back then in 2001 that the forces in the world were aligning in such a way as to present the evidentiary basis of my thesis that this subject of reparative justice will be the greatest political movement of the 21st century. And so far we are approaching the end of the first quarter, and there is tremendous truth in this, that all over the world, in every institution, whether it's university, churches, political parties, international fora, private sector corporations, everywhere in the world, this is the conversation that is attracting people. So it looks as if the projection so far is correct. Many people have said, okay, the climate change movement, the climate change, the global reparatory justice movement, but on the contrary, what the climate change movements are showing, that it is precisely those people who are calling for reparatory justice because of the history of exploitation of their communities, that these are the very communities that are also suffering the greatest ravages of climate change. And so the two movements are now co-joined, that the countries that are being systemically damaged are precisely those countries that are pushing equally for reparatory justice. So let me say this at the outset. What is this all about? What we are witnessing in our lifetimes today, all of us, different age groups, but all of us on this planet, what we are experiencing right now is the unraveling of modernity. How modernity, as we know it today, was built, was constructed. We know that modernity had a primary infrastructure in terms of how European powers, European countries that acquired superior military capacity and were on the cusp of developing the economies on the basis of capitalism, commercial and industrial capitalism and industrialization, that these countries saw an opportunity to use their military capacity to conquer countries and communities around the world with a view to exploiting and extracting their wealth in order to bring that wealth back home to finance and to develop their own countries. And so most of the Western European nations, England, Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, the Dutch, Holland, Germany, Switzerland, Russia, all of them, to varying degrees, plundered the world to extract its wealth for their own domestic development. Britain built the largest commercial empire upon that principle. The Spanish received the blessings of the Pope to ravish and control and own what is now known as the New World, the Americas. And of course, Portugal joined in and extracted Brazil as their piece of the ransom. They also went to Asia and conquered India, established the colonization of India and China and other parts of the Asian continent. And they went to Africa and they did the same. So the Americas, Africa, Asia, Oceania, the Pacific Islands, and so on. And of course, the Americas all fell under the political, military, and economic control of Europe. Now, the techniques and the methods that they use in order to extract that wealth, they use indigenous slavery. They enslave the indigenous peoples of the world, the native communities they found, who were subsequently exposed to a process of genocide. Many of those countries, many of those civilizations have either disappeared completely or partially. So we saw the first crime of genocide imposed upon the native people of the Caribbean, the Americas, and elsewhere. Then we saw the chattel enslavement of Africans. And I emphasize the use of the concept of chattel as a qualification of slavery because many people are very quick to say that there was always slavery on the planet. Well, it's a word that can be used loosely to describe any form of extreme oppression. There are many people who have argued that wives are the slaves of their husbands because they lose their names, they lose their assets, they lose their freedom. And marriage is a kind of slavery. Many people have said that. Many people have said that children are slaves because parents have complete and total control over them as they are growing without their consent. Many people have made those arguments. Now, the point is that what we're speaking about is the imposition of authority, the control of lives, and the extraction of labor. Chattel slavery, however, was unique at this moment in history because it was not just about controlling people's lives, controlling their communities, extracting their wealth, brutalizing them, taking control of their property and their labor. It was much more than that. It was the need to define people legally and to enforce that definition in laws that these African people were not human beings. In fact, this was the first time that people on the basis of their race was denied their right to the human identity. Because under law, the Africans who were enslaved were described as chattel. Chattel is property. And you know what property is. Property is not human. It's inanimate, it's an asset. It has no human identity, it has no right to life. You are no different from a horse, a cow, a sheep, a goat, a building, or what have you. You're the same. And you know what are the characteristics of chattel? You could buy it, you could sell it, you could lease it, you could mortgage it, you can use it to pay your bills, you can transfer it, you can pass it on from parents to children in wills, you can bequeath it, you pay taxes on it because it's a property asset, and so on and so forth. and African people were classified as non-human and therefore property. At the end of that period of slavery, chattel slavery, the Europeans then imposed upon the people of Asia, primarily India and China, a new form of oppression called indentured servitude. This is why thousands of people from India and China were brought to the Caribbean as indentured servants. They were asked to work for a specified number of years under the brutal conditions of the plantations, sugar plantations primarily. They were brought into Guyana not only to do the plantation work, but to lay the infrastructure for bridges, for canals, for building the seawalls and defense and all of those other infrastructures. That system, we describe it as deceptive indentureship, because the people were deceived into imagining a reality that did not materialize. Many scholars have said that indentured servitude was a new kind of slavery. It was not chattel slavery, but it was a different kind of slavery in which people were treated like slaves in many regards, even though they were not chattel. They were contracted persons, contracted slaves, many people have said. So basically, what we are speaking about is how the modern world was built. The foundations on which the modern world was built, the enslavement and genocide of native people all over the world, the racial chattel enslavement of African people all over the world, and the use of deceptive indentured servitude for the people of Asia, India, China, primarily across the world. Now, all of that was based on the system of white supremacy, that white people had no obligation to all of these other races on the planet, that their primary role was labor, and that their role was to enrich the white communities of the world, empower them, give them the assets and the wealth they needed so that European society could flourish, thrive, expand, and become globally dominant on the basis of white supremacy. That the interests of the white people on the planet are to come first, and all other people are secondary and tertiary. What we have seen recently is an enormous global backlash against those principles. The backlash is considered to be economic, moral, and political. It's moral in the sense that there's a growing movement that said that this exploitation of the wealth and resources of races around the world, it was an immoral and criminal act. It exploited the wealth and left those people and countries very poor, while Europe thrived to industrialism and tremendous wealth accumulation, leaving behind a system of racial injustice where in the economies of the world and in the politics of the world, white supremacy is the #1 political characteristic. And so the world is reacting to all of this history. Then, of course, there is a theory of white supremacy and white racism, that we are the wealthiest group of people on the planet, not because we are good at business, but because we are white. And our European ancestry gives us a culture on how to make money, how to generate wealth, and how to globalize wealth. The reaction to that is no, not because we're white. It's because you plundered the world, because you developed weapons. You develop weapons of mass destruction, and you use those weapons of mass destruction to dominate other people, to exploit them, enslave them, extract their wealth, and destroy their countries.